Hi, welcome to this video in which I'll be sharing 8 tips for passing the SQE1. These tips are by no means perfect for your needs and your circumstances, so do take that into account when deciding whether to implement any of these tips. But without further ado, let's take a look at the first tip. The first tip is to make use of active recall in your preparations. The amount of content you need to cover for the SQE is very large, and it's likely that if you covered a topic 4 months before the exam, and even if you understood it well, if you only covered it that one time, there's a good chance that you won't remember that come exam time because of the amount of time that's passed and the amount of content that you'll cover in between then. So active recall requires that you cover the content repeatedly over a period of time so that it's better ingrained in your mind. When it comes to your SQE prep, there's numerous ways that you can incorporate that into your preparation, incorporate the idea of active recall. One way is to use flashcards, but do be careful that your flashcards don't just become a textbook in themselves. At that point, their usefulness is reduced and you won't be going over concepts as many times as you might like. You'd have to condense when you create these flashcards to what's most important. Another way you can incorporate active recall is by creating a spreadsheet of the various SQE subjects and the topics within them. You can put dates besides each one for when you've covered it and use colour coding to highlight whether you found that topic easier or harder. Depending on the colours, you then know how soon to return to that topic and how much attention to give to it. If you highlight a topic in green, for example, you'll know that that's a topic you're more comfortable with and that you can wait longer before returning to it. If you highlight a topic in red, then you know that you should probably give that more attention and return to it more often until it's turned green. But even at that point, you should keep trying to return to it. Because of the amount of content, it's important you keep going over things so that you remember it. A third method that you can incorporate active recall is by using a practice question app or question bank. There's numerous out there, but some incorporate active recall within them. So if you get a question wrong, then it will give you that question more often until you begin to get it correct. So it uses active recall to test those questions and areas that it sees that you are weaker in. So that's a third way you can make use of active recall in your preparations. The second tip is to begin with more difficult content and move to easier content. Now, in a narrow sense, you could apply that in each day of study. If you're covering, for example, business law in a day, you want to cover 3 different subjects in business law. You could start by covering the harder subject in that day and move to the easier subjects. That way, as the day progresses, it becomes easier for you. Naturally, we can become more tired as time goes on. So it's adapting to how your mind might work, how most people's minds work as the day goes on. They might begin to feel more tired, and it's helpful at that point then to be covering easier content rather than harder content. It can be applied in a wider sense too if we look at your overall schedule for preparing for the SQE. When you begin, which subjects you choose to cover, you could begin by covering those that students typically find more difficult, such as property practice and business law, and move on towards the end to easier subjects, or those that students usually find easier, such as contract law and ethics. So that's the second tip. Try to start with content that is more difficult and move to easier content as time goes on. The third tip is to time yourself as you do practice questions. At the start, this isn't as important because you should focus more on being able to understand what's in the question, filter out what's unnecessary, and get better at that process. But especially as you get closer to the exam, you need to begin timing yourself to make sure that you can answer questions within an appropriate amount of time. You don't want to get to the exam and if you've not timed yourself answering questions, missing many questions out because you've run out of time, because you spent too long reading, for example. So definitely time yourself. Obviously, there's the average of 1 minute 42 seconds per question, but account as well for the fact that some questions are a lot smaller than others. So you'll need to adapt accordingly and just make sure you're answering those questions in an appropriate amount of time. The fourth tip is to get used to long mock exams to build up your stamina for the exam itself. The exam day is really long with 2.5 hour sessions. If you've not practiced questions for long sessions like that, then you do risk becoming fatigued on the exam day itself. So as time goes on, as you do practice questions, start to incorporate mocks into your preparation so that you are getting used to the format of the day itself and being able to sit down at your computer and complete questions for hours. That way, when it comes to the day itself, it won't be as challenging for you because it's something you've done already. The fifth tip is to try and book your FLK1 and FLK2 exams as far apart as possible. The reason for this is twofold, really. The first is so that you can recover after your FLK1 exam and not immediately have to rush into preparing for FLK2. You can at least potentially have an evening to recover from FLK1 before you move on to your FLK2 preparations. And you won't have to worry as much because you know that FLK2 is still about 9 or 10 days away, potentially. The other reason is because the content that you cover immediately before the exam, in those, let's say, a week before the exam, you're much more likely to remember in the exam itself compared to content you might have covered a few months ago, a few weeks ago. So I think it's a useful technique to distance FLK1 and FLK2 as far apart as possible. And then potentially, let's say in the 10 days before FLK1, you focus solely on FLK1 preparation. And then once FLK1's out of the way, you can then return to your FLK2 prep and focus on that FLK2 prep for that remaining period of however long that gap is between your FLK1 and your FLK2 exams. The sixth tip is to familiarize yourself with Pearson's SQE1 functionality tool. So through the SRA's website, I'll link it down in the description. You can access a mock of what the exam will look like on the day itself. It's a good idea to get used to how it will look on the day. So knowing where the calculator is, for example, on that system, being able to use the flagging system. You want to make it as familiar as possible so that when it comes to the day, you're not having to fiddle around with the program or figure out how to use it. You're already familiar with that and you can get straight on to answering the questions. When it comes to the exam day itself, every second will count. The seventh tip is to aim high. A lot of people might only need to pass the SQE. They don't necessarily need a second quintile or first quintile pass. But despite that, it's useful psychologically as you approach your preparations, if you have the time, depending on your circumstances, to aim for a first quintile pass nonetheless. That psychologically might affect how you prepare. You might be less likely to cut corners or skip topics or take it easy, knowing that you can score only 65%, for example, compared to 80%. It's a good idea to approach it with first quintile because if that's what you aim for and you want the standard of knowledge to get a first quintile pass, then you're giving yourself a much greater margin of safety to pass the exam. For a lot of people preparing, you might have a training contract on the line, or you might have spent quite a bit of money on purchasing your seat for the exam. So you don't want that to go to waste. And the best way to prevent that from happening is to aim for a first quintile pass, to have that standard of knowledge so that you're much more likely to succeed and reduce the risk of failure. So that's the 7th tip. Aim high, if possible, for first quintile pass. And it might seem challenging, there's a lot of content, but people can achieve first quintile passes, and with the right amount of effort and investment, you might be able to as well. The final tip is to stay positive throughout the process. It can be quite grueling and that lends itself to negativity, but try to stay positive. Maybe remind yourself of what brought you to the SQE, what lies at the end of the process, and try to just enjoy learning about law. It is a subject that so many are passionate about, and now is an opportunity to learn about so many areas that you might not learn about otherwise. So try to stay positive, try to surround yourself with positive people and communities during this time. Be careful what you expose yourself to, and yeah, just do your best to stay positive throughout it. That will make studying easier and make it easier to sit down each morning or whenever you begin preparing, and to memorize the information as well, because it's something that you wanted to do rather than felt like you're being forced into doing. Those are 8 tips for the SQE1. There's many others too. If you're preparing for the SQE1 now and you've got a good tip, then maybe pop it down in the comments for others to see. Please consider as well liking and subscribing to this video. And until the next video, best of luck with your preparations.